7 tips today to conquer mold toxicity. And so let's dive in first to some of the symptoms, right? Some of the symptoms associated with a mold toxicity. So who should be thinking maybe it's mold? Like, what are the main things that we're going to be experiencing? So symptom number 1, and probably one of the most pervasive and common symptoms of a mold toxicity, is chronic sinusitis, nasal infections. There was a study done, I think it was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association a number of years ago in my area. Actually, the study was done on participants in my area of Southeast Texas along the coastline, is that most cases of upper respiratory infections, which is, your common colds that, when you go to the doctor and they give you a diagnosis of an upper respiratory infection, what do most doctors do? They say, here's the antibiotic, right? They don't differentiate whether it's a bacterial infection or a mold infection. But a lot of these infections are mold oriented. So, think about this. Even if you suffer with chronic sinusitis or what you feel like might be chronic environmental allergies, it could very well possibly be mold growing inside of your sinuses, creating those symptoms. So one of the things that can be done is a culture swab, where you can take a swab and run it up the nose into the sinus cavities, and you can actually then send those can be sent to the lab. Your doctor can run this type of test, and you can grow them, right? And you can differentiate, is it mold, is it bacteria? If it's mold or bacteria, what kind of mold or what kind of bacteria? And even beyond that, you can differentiate what type of treatment might work best to kill what you have. So for example, if it's not mold, but it is bacteria, which antibiotic will work against it, or which natural agent might work against it? Because if it is a bacterial infection and not a mold infection, you certainly might need an antibiotic, but you don't want to just throw a broad spectrum antibiotic at it, because that's why we have antibiotic resistance, is that doctors aren't doing enough differentiation. So if you're finding yourself struggling with chronic sinusitis, very, very common, that it's a mold infection and not a bacterial infection. So make sure before you take an antibiotic, make sure you ask your doctor to differentiate between the two. And this can take up to 4 weeks. So when you're culturing mold from a sinus culture, it can take up to 4 weeks to get a result back. So, and that's because we want to wait long enough for that culture to be able to propagate and grow mold. Sometimes mold takes a little bit longer to grow in a culture. So keep that in mind. One of the other symptoms of chronic mold chronic mold exposure is debilitating fatigue. I mean, unendearing, debilitating fatigue. You sleep 10 hours, you wake up and you want to sleep 10 more hours. You're that tired. So if you're suffering with like a chronic fatigue syndrome, this is oftentimes, or can be, it's not the only cause of CFS, but it can be one of the causes of chronic fatigue. So if you're suffering with unendearing fatigue that's not relieved by rest, then you might want to think about or start thinking about mold. Immune dysfunction. If you pick up every little infection, every little cold, every little flu, every little bug that comes through your life, and you're picking it up and you're chronically the one that's being sick, that is a sign of mold toxicity as well. Remember, mold can suppress the immune system over time, and that leads to recurring infections. Sleep issues. One of the byproducts of mold is that it can disrupt hormones, and some of these hormones affect how you're able to go to sleep and stay asleep. Migraine headaches. Very, very common to see this in mold sufferers. It's the mold exposure can trigger migraine headaches. Muscle and joint pain, super, super common to see that. Now, those symptoms that I just gave you, again, the chronic sinusitis, the debilitating fatigue, the immune dysfunction, the sleep issues, the migraine headaches, and the muscle and joint pain, those symptoms are more what we see with environmental mold. So like mold that's in your home, or mold that's at your workplace, or mold that maybe even in your car, right? But then there are also like yeast infections, where you have like women can pick up vaginal yeast infections or oral thrush. You can get yeast infections in the GI tract, candida overgrowth, for example. These can cause different they can cause similar symptoms, but they can also cause kind of very different types of symptoms. So some of the more common, if the mold is inside of you and not in your environment, in essence, you can be mold sick from mold being in your environment. You can be mold sick from mold growing inside of you. Some of the symptoms of mold growing inside of you, especially as they're linked to candida, are chronic sugar craving. Like you have the sugar bug, and you chronically crave sweets. Severe irritability and mood swings. Women, if you struggle with hormone dysfunction, if your periods and your cycles become irregular, very, very common to see that with a candida overgrowth. So again, just some differentiation between external and internal mold, although oftentimes it's both, or it can be. So keep those things in mind. So Now let's talk about what we can do about it. So those are the symptoms. So what do we do? Okay, so those of you that have had water damage, again, whether you've been in a hurricane and your home was flooded, or whether or not you had roof leak and your home got water in it, or the AC busted and the drain pan dripped and got into your insulation in your attic, or a pipe busted in your house, it doesn't matter. Whatever happened, we're wanting to know, what do you do after the water damage? Once the damage is done, is that house a safe house, or do you sell it and move out? No, you can have a safe house even after water damage, but it's very, very critical that you take the right and appropriate steps. So if you've got water damage in the home, the very first thing that you want to make sure that you are doing is assess the damage and how extensive the damage actually is. So obviously, whether it was a pipe busted or whether it was a roof leak, you've got to assess where the leak is and how much and how far did that water penetrate and potentiate the growth, or potentially allow for the growth of mold and spreading of mold growth. So you have to look and assess the damage, obviously, once the water's gone. But any of the water damaged area needs to be completely removed. So for example, if it's an area where a pipe broke behind the wall and it damaged a big, let's say it damaged a big 2-foot piece of sheetrock, you need to take at least 24 and preferably 36 inches away from the water damage. Remember that sheetrock is like a sponge. Once water hits it, it absorbs the water and distributes that water into the sheetrock. I've actually seen cases of severe mold toxicity behind somebody's wall where the mold was so thick growing behind the wall, you couldn't see it because it was growing behind the wall, but was making this particular individual extremely, extremely ill. So keep that in mind, that you want to remove the water damaged material, and preferably, again, if it's an absorptive material, you don't want to just remove the area that had the water damage. You don't want to just paint over it or spray some type of primer paint on it and expect that that's not going to grow mold. Some people, they get water damage and they're like, oh, let's cover the water damage up with a primer. That's a horrible idea. One of the worst things you can do is cover up the potential water damage and just assume that mold won't grow. You want to cut that area out, preferably 2 to 3 feet around that area, make sure that everything's dry. So after the water damage, you want to make sure you remove any of the materials, whether it was wood or sheetrock or whether it was insulation, doesn't matter. You want to make sure that you remove all of those materials and the material around it, if it was an absorptive material, where you're not actually letting that water stay in a dark, damp area where the mold can now have the perfect environment to potentiate. One of the other things, once you're done cutting out the areas where there's been the water damage, you need to let time you need to have time on your side where you're letting it air out. So some of the strategies with that is you want to make sure you have plenty of time for it to dry. Don't just rip out the damaged area and then immediately replace the sheetrock, because if the water and the humidity are still too high, you can still have the potentiation for that mold to grow. So again, it's important to give enough time to let that water damaged area air out. And so fans and dehumidifiers are very, very helpful with this. So, running a dehumidifier that pulls the water out of the air so that you can speed this process up. Fans help circulate the moisture out of the area. That can speed up the process, but don't shortchange on the time here. You really want to let the area dry before you go to try to repair it, so that you minimize any potential for mold regrowth. Now, once you get the repairs done, some of the things to kind of look out for. If you're struggling with chronic illness, especially, maybe you've already had water damage to your home and you didn't even think about it before today. You weren't even thinking about this. You might want to look at some proper testing to evaluate mold. And so there are different types of tests that can evaluate whether the mold, one, is growing in your environment, or two, whether or not the mold is growing inside of you. So if we're talking about environmental testing to try to evaluate mold, there are several different types of tests that can be done. Some people call the insurance contractor, get a recommendation for a mold remediation specialist, and they can come out with special sensors and equipment to help evaluate the mold spores in the environment. Now, that can be helpful and it can be effective, but it's not always 100% accurate. So you have to be careful, especially if you live in a humid area. If you live in a humid area, remember what they do with these when they come and test your mold spores in your home is they compare the outdoor air to the indoor air in your home. among different rooms. And if you have a moldy community that you live in already, if the external environment is already very humid, like in the Houston area, for example, they're using the outdoor air as a comparative to your indoor air. And so you can get kind of misleading or false data on the test results. So it can be helpful, but it's not always necessarily the best thing. One of the types of tests that can be done, though, that I like to see people using is to do a mold collection, dust collection. And the name of this test is called an ERMI, E-R-M-I. And again, no test is 100% accurate, but an ERMI actually measures mold spore counts based on the quantity of dust. So you do a dust job in certain areas of the home, and they're measuring the mold and the different species of mold spores in the dust of your home. And this can actually be very, very helpful as compared to just doing an air test alone. So an ERMI test, E-R-M-I, it stands for Environmental Relativity Mold Index. And this test can actually be ordered online. There's a company called mycometrics, mycometrics.com. And this company actually, you can purchase a kit online, and you can run an ERMI test very, very simply in your home to try to detect whether or not there's persistent or high levels of mold spore counts, or whether or not you have high levels of mold. Now, one of the other things that can be done is testing yourself, because sometimes it's not mold that gets you, it's something called a mycotoxin. And a mycotoxin is harder to detect. So a lot of your air tests and even your dust tests, they're measuring for mold spores, but they're not measuring for the toxins that mold produce. So there are a number of different toxins. Remember, mold can produce biological toxins, aflatoxin, ochratoxin, trichothecene are just examples of different forms of mold toxins. So again, if you've got mold growing in your home and those mold species are producing the mycotoxins, you can actually breathe in these mycotoxins, and they can make you actually, in many cases, even sicker than mold. Some people are allergic to mold. Some people react badly to mycotoxins, and some get it from both sides. They get mold and mycotoxin exposure. So running a mycotoxin test, this can be done. You can ask your doctor to order a mycotoxin test on you to look to see whether or not you have accumulation of heavy levels of mold toxins circulating in your body. One of the other, there are some immune tests that can also be done that help us to know whether or not you've got chronic mold exposure issues. And one of those tests is called MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. This particular test helps to determine a level of a hormone that oftentimes is very low or non-existent when people have chronic mold exposure. So you're looking for low levels of MSH. Another type of test that can commonly be very, very high, 2 to 3 and sometimes 4 times or more elevated the normal value, is something called transforming growth factor beta 1, or TGF beta 1. This particular marker is an immune marker, can be measured, can be measured by most labs, or by most even traditional doctors can measure this using traditional lab methodologies. So TGF beta 1 is again, it's an inflammatory marker that can be measured or picked up, and oftentimes is an indicator of high mold exposure. Now, be careful here. If you're not gluten-free, remember that TGF beta 1 can also be elevated in patients that have gluten sensitivity who are being exposed to gluten. So you've got to make sure that if you're not gluten-free but you are gluten sensitive, that you don't suspect mold if you haven't also ruled out gluten, because again, that type of test can be high for that reason. Another test that your doctor can order is a complement 4A test, or a C4A test, which is also an immune test that can measure whether or not it can be, again, it's an indicator of whether or not you've been exposed to chronic mold. Complement is a type of immune protein, and complement 4A particularly is a type of immune protein that commonly is elevated in individuals who have an inflammatory process from chronic mold exposure. Now, I mentioned earlier doing a nasal culture. You can do a nasal culture too to identify mold growing in the sinuses. You can do oral cultures as well. Doctors can run oral cultures to see if there's mold growing inside the mouth, and then you can also do GI cultures. You can do GI tract stool testing that can help identify or measure whether or not there's mold growing or overgrowth inside the GI tract. And then, of course, having a doctor qualified to do a physical examination to look at your fingernails. Sometimes we see signs of mold overgrowth in the fingernails and the toenails. Sometimes we see it on the skin. Mold can manifest as eczema or eczema-like disease. So again, a physical examination can sometimes also be a very valuable tool in helping a doctor to rule out whether or not you're getting chronic mold exposure or have a mold infection. So another type of test is just running circulating antibodies. There are tests that doctors can order that look at antibodies for specific types of mold species. And then you can also be tested for mold allergy, because if you're, obviously if you're not mold allergic, but you are in a moldy environment, you might be less susceptible to worrying about mold as a problem. So keep in mind, those are just different types of tests that can be done that can help you identify whether it's an issue. So let's talk about number 4. Number 4 is humidity and air quality control. So if we're trying, let's just say we're trying to reduce, be proactive and reduce mold growth in our home. One thing that can be done is controlling the humidity. Now, keeping the humidity low in the home. And understand that your air conditioner is a natural dehumidifier. So just running the AC unit is going to keep the humidity down in the home. But some of you, again, maybe you live in more humid climates. Maybe you have a basement. Basements tend to take on extra water and tend to be a big source for mold for a lot of people. So if you live kind of further north, I mean, we're on the coast, so we don't build basements down here, but further north, basements are a really common room built into most homes. And so basements can be an excellent source of moisture in the home for mold to propagate. So keep in mind measuring the humidity in those basements and keeping the relative humidity in those areas under 55% is ideal for preventing mold growth. Some would even say keep it lower than 50% and be more aggressive. Now, I talked about drying your home out earlier. When you're trying to dry your home out, you want to run dehumidifiers in a very, very big way where you're getting that humidity down below 30%, preferably in the 20% range. So you're pulling a lot of that moisture out so that you reduce, again, you're trying to reduce the risk that mold is going to grow after that water damage is done. So air control, keeping humidity low, can be very, very helpful as a mold preventative. Another one is the use of HEPA. HEPA is a special type of air filter that can capture mold spores. Now, HEPA filters will not capture mycotoxins, but they will capture mold spores. And if you have a HEPA filter unit with a UV light attached to it, an ultraviolet light attached to it, remember that HEPA captures mold spores, UV light kills mold spores. So you kind of want the 1-2 punch combination. Capture and kill. Don't capture and keep the mold as pets in a filter, right? So capture and kill is what you're really after. And so that's a very, very good strategy in terms of just prevention, right? We're trying to prevent a problem from occurring in the first place. Now, one of the other strategies, number 5, is that a lot of people don't realize that we get mold in food. And there are a number of different foods that you may be eating that are considered to be high mold foods. Probably the most common of the high mold foods are the grains. And part of what I wrote about in No Grain, No Pain, right, was again, I told you before, this book was not just about gluten. It was about a lot of the detrimental properties that grain can bring to the table, like literally bring to the table, right? And one of them is mold. Now, in the US, we don't really have any kind of mold or mycotoxin restriction on foods to any great degree, particularly mycotoxin restriction. So many of our grains, our wheat, our barley, our rye, our oats, our corn, and our rice, and our millet, and our sorghum, these grains oftentimes will be very, very high sources of mold toxins, particularly things like ochratoxin and aflatoxins. So if you're mycotoxin sensitive, avoiding these mold heavy foods can be very, very important. It can be a very, very important strategy. Coffee is a high mold food. Coffee, the way coffee is grown, the way coffee beans are stored, it can be a very high mold food. Other foods that can be high mold, anything that is stored for long periods of time when it's being before it's processed. So think produce, think vegetables. A lot of them are sprayed with antifungals. So there's less mold growth. But imagine going to the grocery store, and this probably happened to you. I see it all the time, actually. You go to the grocery store and you see like a cantaloupe, for example. Cantaloupe has all those ridges on the surface of the skin, perfect for mold growth. Mold gets into those ridges and it can grow. So when you're picking up your produce in the grocery department, fresh vegetables, fresh fruits, you really want to make sure that you're inspecting it for obvious visible signs of excessive mold. I mean, obviously you're not going to buy a moldy piece of fruit, but what sometimes happens is there's a little tiny bit growing on part of it that you didn't pick up on, and that can become a problem. So again, inspect your produce before you purchase it, and minimize your risk of getting excessive mold. The other thing is the way you store your produce. Storing it in the refrigerator can help reduce mold growth on it as it sits on the counter at home. It's going to have a tendency to pick mold up, and because there's spores floating around, it's natural. We're not going to escape that. But keeping it in the refrigerator will preserve it and help prevent some of that. So again, high mold foods or foods that have mold growing on them, inspect those things and use that as a strategy as you move forward. And then one of the other probably most frequently asked questions I get when it comes to mold toxicity is if I have it, is what are some things supplementally I can do to help my body detoxify from mold? Number one, aside from all these other things that we've talked about, removing the moldy environment. If the mold is growing in your environment, all the supplements in the world are not going to help you if you don't remove yourself from the moldy environment. So the most crucial, important thing, first and foremost, is to get out of the moldy environment or to clean up or remediate or mitigate the mold exposure. So if it's environmental mold, you've got to get out of the environment, or you won't make a recovery. And if you've got chronic mold illness, those of you who've ever had it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You cannot recover if you maintain yourself in that environment. But there are some supplements that can help with detoxification that I have in my own personal practice experienced work really, really well for people. One of them is good old-fashioned vitamin C. Vitamin C it helps with bile formation. Remember, one of the ways that we bind mold toxins is through bile in the intestines. So the liver produces the bile, the gallbladder secretes the bile. The bile then can help bind mold toxins, mycotoxins in the intestine and excrete them out. So vitamin C is a necessary component to properly produce bile, and that's one of the reasons why it can be such an effective tool, because many people don't get enough vitamin C in their diet, or they're already vitamin C deficient. Now, vitamin C works in many other ways as well. It works as a free radical scavenger. It works as a chelating agent. So it works in other ways. It works to boost and build. It's a fuel for your natural killer cells, which are part of your immune system. So it's very, very important. You want to support your immune system's capacity to detoxify these toxins out of your body. So vitamin C is one of my favorite, and using vitamin C in conjunction with a quercetin works really, really well. So quercetin is a compound found in a number of different plants, but quercetin works really, really well as an anti-inflammatory to help detoxify and to help mitigate a number of the inflammatory symptoms of mold toxicity. One of my other favorites is activated charcoal. Activated charcoal can be a binder. So if you're eating foods and maybe you're doing the best that you can to avoid eating moldy foods, but some is still coming in. Ultimately, yeast and mold are a part of our natural environment. So activated carbon can be a great binder and can help mitigate excessive mold coming in, as can a supplement called EDTA. Works extremely, extremely well. It not only does it work as a chelating agent to bind mycotoxins, but it actually now has been shown to be both antibacterial and antifungal. So it can work extremely well in situations where chronic mold exposure is a problem. And one of the other things I like to do supplementally is really support phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification. And so using a supplement that might contain heavy doses of N-acetylcysteine, as well as milk thistle, can be extremely helpful in allowing your liver to help detoxify some of these poisons and some of these mold toxins and excrete them from the body. Now, if you're going to use supplements to aid in the removal of mold toxins, it's very important that you follow and adhere to some general principles of intelligent detoxification. One is you got to make sure that your kidneys are turned on and that you're urinating frequently as you're doing your detoxification. Otherwise, you get what's called retox. So you're pulling mold toxins out, you're breaking them down, but if you're not pushing them out through your urine, then they're just recirculating through your system and then redepositing back into your tissue. So keep your kidneys activated. So make sure you're drinking enough fluids that you're peeing at least 6 times a day, full void peeing, at least that much when you're going through a detoxification protocol. One of the other things it's important to do is to sweat. Now, if you're mold toxic, you might not have the capacity to exercise and sweat through exercise because you're just so tired and your body's so defeated. So one of the things that you can do is you can sweat through the use of a sauna. My favorite is using like an infrared type of device, an infrared. And I had a gentleman on the show a few months ago where we talked about saunas. You can go back and review that, where we talked all about detoxification strategies. And so an infrared can be very, very effective at helping cleanse the body of toxins, and in conjunction with lots of making sure you're having ample urination. And then the other is make sure that the bowels are moving. Don't get into a situation where you're constipated when you're trying to go through a detoxification, because again, we don't want those toxins staying inside of you for any length of time. So we want to keep the bowels moving. We want to keep the bowels pushing the waste out, because if your bile is binding onto those molds and mold toxins and you're constipated, then you're not going to get rid of them. They're just going to sit there and they're going to continue to slowly poison you. So make sure sweating, urinating, and defecating when you're going through any detoxification program is going to be crucial and vital. So those systems need to be turned on, ramped up, and working very, very well as long as you're doing any kind of major detoxification support. Where we see people oftentimes struggle with detoxification, like you try to detox and you feel worse, it's oftentimes because they're not doing those other three things. Sometimes it's because some people are poor methylators and they have genetic mutations, and so they don't do well with heavy doses of supplements, and so you've got to start small and work your way up. So keep that in mind too. If you've been that type of individual where you find when you try to do supplements that it crashes you, makes you hit the floor, it may be that you need to work your way into it much more slowly. So again, keep that in mind as a strategy if you're going to be using supplements to help to do a detoxification protocol. So those are the 7 strategies that I have for you today. Now I'm going to open up the floor for your questions. And again, if you haven't chimed in, if you're just sitting around listening but not participating, let me know where you're from. Chime in, say hello, hit the like button, and hit the share button. Make sure you're sharing this information with a friend, a family member, or loved one, so that we can help more people together. So let's go through some of the questions and comments and get everybody taken care of today. Tracy Elizabeth is saying, especially with CIRS. So I was talking earlier about mold, and CIRS is chronic inflammatory syndrome, and CIRS is a very, very common byproduct or a very, very common diagnosis for people with mold. So if you've been diagnosed with CIRS, then you definitely want to consider mold as a problem or part of this issue. Thanks, Tracy, for chiming in on that. Let's see here. Diane, I have had an issue with bronchitis and respiratory infection 3 times in 3 months. Diane, what you may want to consider, again, if you haven't already, is if your doctors haven't differentiated the reason you have that bronchitis. In essence, again, it could be mold, it could be bacterial, it could be viral. Some advanced testing might be necessary. Now, I've also seen people develop chronic bronchitis and respiratory infection as a result of eating foods that they were allergic to. So that's just another strategy. If you haven't been food allergy tested, or if you haven't been gluten tested, genetically tested for gluten sensitivity, then definitely do that, because if you're producing, your second comment was mucus production as being a part of the issue. So, mucus is one of those things that will form anytime our body perceives a threat coming in. We can form mucus in the lungs, we can form mucus in the throat. And some foods are mucus forming, like dairy can be extremely mucus forming. So if you're already struggling with a chronic infection or a chronic issue where you're already overproducing mucus, eating mucus producing foods can make that worse. So like bananas and sugary foods can increase mucus production, as can dairy. So keep those things in mind as well. All right. Question coming in, Prioshka. Hi, Dr. Osborne. I get stools which are hard or loose every 4 days. I have no bacterial infection. How do I make my stools normal? That's a pretty broad question, but I'll give you a couple of strategies. One of the things that you might want to try, again, without any testing to help me help you, it's hard to guess at this, but I would say that one of the primary things that you could use to regulate your stools, or to look on to if you're kind of back and forth with this IBS-C, IBS-D type problem, is one, your stomach acid could be too low, and that stomach acid oftentimes being too low leads to constipation followed by loose stools. So kind of this intermittent flaring where you go days with constipation and then bam, you have loose stools. Another would be your microbiome itself. Is do you have adequate healthy gut bacteria colonizing your GI tract, helping run the normal functions of your gut. So I would look at, your microbiome. I would look at your stomach acid production as kind of two really easy places to start. If you suspect low stomach acid, you can take something called betaine hydrochloride. I have something called ultra acid that I like to use in my patients. It's a form of mixture of betaine hydrochloride and some other things that help to improve stomach acid. But it's really safe and really easy to take. And sometimes constipation clears right up, and that it's kind of like a clinical answer. You try it and it works, and you kind of have an answer as to why. Oh, this is a follow-up. This is a good follow-up, so I want to bring this up too. So if ferritin is high, around 1,020, and hemoglobin is low, that's definitely a liver issue. When ferritin is that high, the liver is usually releasing it en masse, and that's the liver's taking on damage. So you've got to identify what's creating the liver damage. In my experience, one of the most common causes of liver disease, especially if you're not an alcoholic or you don't drink alcohol, is gluten, is grain exposure, corn and wheat. Very, very common to see those cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and liver damage, and elevate those ferritin levels to that degree. Good question. Janice, opinion on Air Doctor air filters. Good filters. So if you've got one, you've got a good filter in your home and in your place. Susan Christensen is chiming in to eat garlic. Yeah, garlic's a great antimicrobial. It's an antifungal. It's antimicrobial. So it's great. I mean, it's natural as a food. Food can be great medicine. So it's great. However, some people don't tolerate garlic. So if you have a lot of gas and bloating, and you have ever heard of the FODMAP diet, keep that in mind, because if you start eating a bunch of garlic and you just start bloating and getting a lot more gas, it could be that you are FODMAP, that you're struggling with digesting FODMAPs, and that pay attention to that. So, and I've seen that be the case with garlic and shallots and some of the other things, natural remedies to help kill bugs, where somebody has a FODMAP sensitivity. Yeah, eating asparagus. I talked about this yesterday. Josh Axe, Dr. Axe, and I did a live group together, and we were talking about how great asparagus was, Susan, and as a great diuretic. It helps to stimulate water output through the kidneys. It also is a great detoxifier. So thanks for chiming in on that. Oh, we got Nancy from New Mexico. So another state representing. Hi, Nancy, and Amy and Jeremy from Georgia. Let's see. Next question here. Amanda is, so with MTHFR, we need to start supplements in lower doses at first, question mark. I'm compound heterozygous. That's not what I would consider to be a major MTHFR mutation. Heterozygous mutations are not really deal breakers unless you're super, super sick. Then yes, we might want to support that MTHFR mutation. The answer is not just whether or not you have an MTHFR mutation. There's MTR, there's MTRR, there's COMT, there's DAO. There's all different types of genetic mutations that can occur in individuals that can affect the methylation cascade. So the better thing is not just, okay, do we just look only at MTHFR? Because a lot of doctors and a lot of labs are just running MTHFR as if it's going to make some massive, huge difference in a person's life, just having that one genetic SNP. Remember, you've got 23,000 sets of genes. One out of those 23,000 is not really gonna tell us a whole lot. You really, if you're looking at methylation, which is what we're talking about with this detoxification pathway, methylation and something called transsulfuration, we want to look at the genes responsible for those pathways and look at mutations. So looking at the genes from a more broad spectrum, comprehensive picture would be where I'd start. But yeah, and in terms of supplementation, people with mutations in the methylation cycle generally don't tend to do well with high-dose supplementation if they have certain mutation patterns. So just knowing your MTHFR doesn't really give me a whole lot to work from. But if I had a more comprehensive picture of what was going on in your DNA methylation pattern, I could give you a better answer, Amanda. Susanna, hello from South Carolina. Yeah, thank another state. I met a doctor yesterday from the Carolinas. A great guy, great doctor. I was in Tennessee. Let's see here, Nancy. My friend keeps telling me I should take activated charcoal to rid a lingering staph and marcons. I've just kept with the protocol that doesn't include charcoal. That's correct. Now, charcoal can be used, and it's very, very safe to use, but it's not always necessary. And when you're on a big protocol where you're already doing a lot of different kinds of pills, sometimes it's a matter of weighing how much can we do to maintain a good compliance, because when you get a pill overloaded, sometimes that's kind of the rate limiter in whether or not a person's going to improve or not. Okay. Ellen, best supplements for candida that are not going to make my hair fall out. Well, I would say if you're talking about just in general, best supplements, there are a number of things that have been shown to be effective for killing candida that shouldn't make your hair fall out. I'd say if your hair's falling out, it's probably not supplements creating the issue as much as it might be a protein malnutrition. When your immune system is battling a chronic yeast infection, you will oftentimes, the side effect of that is protein malnourishment. We don't get enough protein to come in to make enough antibodies to continue to fight the war. And so what happens is hair becomes a secondary need. In essence, your body looks at hair and says, we're not going to make hair because we need to use that protein to make antibodies instead. So I would say you might want to consider that and have a doctor checking your protein status, your albumin and your other serum protein levels to see if even that's part of the issue. But one of the other things, a good supplement to support hair growth is collagen. And there are a number of different collagen formulations. But collagen is great and helpful for hair growth, as is biotin to support hair growth. But again, your body's not going to grow hair if you're fighting a chronic infection. The protein is necessary to make antibodies, and that will trump hair growth and fingernail growth. We'll oftentimes see weakened fingernails and hair falling out when people have chronic immune problems caused by mold. So keep that in mind as well, Ellen. But as far as other supplements for yeast, oregano can be effective, thyme can be effective, uva ursi can be effective, berberine can be effective, grapefruit seed extract. There are a lot of different types of supplements that can be effective, again, depending on the yeast. Some yeast have resistances to certain natural agents. I've seen a number of cases in patients where, yeast overgrowth was resistant to oregano, so taking all the oregano oil in the world wasn't effective at all, and just really didn't work. So again, hopefully those are some strategies you can take with you. Georgia, hi there. Tennessee, thoughts on this new hemp oil being advertised? Was told no TCH and helps with pain. I'm going to assume you mean THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, and helps with pain management. Look, my bigger question with things like hemp oil and even cannabis oil is, why do you need that type of oil to manage pain? If you really found the root cause of the pain, you don't need oils to manage your pain. And that's where really I would encourage you to explore with a good functional medicine doctor that avenue over, taking even things taken naturally to reduce your symptoms. To me, that can be dangerous long term. And it's not that I'm not compassionate about people's pain. It's that, look, if we mask your pain but don't find out why it's there, are we really serving you? No, I don't think we are. I think we're making you dependent on hemp oil or cannabis oil or some other type of product. And I'm not picking on those things, but any product for that matter, if we're just trying to manage pain without trying to ascertain the origin of why the pain and why the inflammation is there in the first place. So I would be real cautious about anything that is going to have a pain masking effect, unless your strategy is mask the pain in the short term to improve your quality of life while you're working with a good functional medicine doctor who can help you figure out the real solution behind why the pain and inflammation are persistent. Good questions. Teresa, been on antibiotics for over a week now for strep. Now, what should I do to get my gut back in shape? Great question. You've got to absolutely have a heavy dose probiotic. I recommend at least 200 billion colony forming units to help to boost the GI tract back from an antibiotic regimen. So one of the, in my opinion, one of the best ones to use product called Ultrabiotic Defense. It's over 200 billion colony forming units of very hardy types of bifido and lactobacillus. Can be very, very helpful at supporting restoration of the microbiome after you've been on an antibiotic. That's what I would recommend as a primary. You've got to do, at the very minimum, you've got to do that to get your microbiome back up to speed. Let's see, some of the other questions coming in. Kathy from Washington State. All right, I have an egg allergy that does not cause anaphylactic reaction, meaning it's not acute, but it causes stomach upset and sore muscles a couple of days after. There's a collagen powder that has different animal ingredients, including egg membrane. I'm not sure I see the question in that. If you have an egg allergy, I would consider a collagen protein powder that doesn't have the egg membrane and first, just to be cautious, right? So there are a number of different powders out there, and some of them really good ones. The egg membrane is a great product if you're not allergic to the egg, but also depends on which part of the egg that you're allergic to. Some people are allergic to the yolk, some to the white. But my experience with it is if you're allergic to the yolk or the white, avoid egg until we get your gut back in balance. So I would look for different collagen products that don't have the egg in them as my advice for you. Good question. So Leanna is asking, why would C4A be high? Is that mold toxicity? Yes, it can be, and oftentimes is. It's not. So understand that C4A, complement 4A, is a protein the immune system produces, and it's not implicit to mold, meaning that just because C4A is high doesn't mean you have mold toxicity, but it can mean that you have mold toxicity. So doing a good mold panel where you're looking at transforming growth factor beta 1, where you're looking at MSH, where you're looking at C4A, where you're looking at C-reactive protein, where you're looking at a number of different markers that might be conducive to giving you a bigger answer about the whole picture. And another test to be run is called the HLA-DR genotyping, which can tell you whether or not you have a gene pattern that is generally sensitive to mold. So that's what I would recommend, Leanna. Don't just rely strictly on a C4A, again, because it can mean mold, but it can also mean other things as well. So, all right, looks like I've gotten to the end of all the questions today. Make sure, a couple of things as we close out today. We'll be back next week for another episode of Live. But I want you to make sure that you're sharing this information with somebody you love, especially if you know somebody that's in a water damaged area where maybe they haven't put their home back together yet. Let's get this information into those people's hands, because I did this show special for them today. So help me get this information to them by hitting the share, hitting the like button below. And thanks for helping me help more people. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be able to reach so many people through you. And I appreciate you all being here with me today. Looks like I'm going to answer one more because we had one more come in while I was talking. But I took Cipro that killed my Oxalobacter formininges. How can I reestablish my population to digest oxalates again? One of the best ways that you can really reestablish is through a high dose probiotic. There's not really to my knowledge at this point, there's not really a great commercially available Oxalobacter that you can take. But if you do any gardening, if you do any outside work where you get your hands dirty, where you get your hands in the dirt, it's one of the best ways to get probiotics. If you've got a pet, it's one of the best ways to get probiotics. So if you live in the city, you're a city person, go visit a farm. Go out and visit a farm and interact with the animals, interact with the dirt a little bit more aggressively, and that can be very, very helpful. The other thing is eating produce from locally grown farmers markets, locally grown because they're not being shipped across the country and being sprayed with chemicals. But also much of that local produce is going to have probiotic that's going to have soil microorganisms in it, and that's going to be very, very helpful to help reestablish your flora. So, okay, that was it. So hope you guys have a great afternoon. We will be back next week for another episode of Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. Until then, have a wonderful weekend. Take care.